So welcome, good afternoon, or if you're on the West Coast, it may still be morning there. I am on the East Coast in Raleigh, North Carolina. My name is Diane Talley. I'm a psychometrician on the IT credentialing team for Alpine. Brett Foley is on our PC team, our professional credentialing team. Brett, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, this is Brett Foley. As Diane mentioned, I'm a senior psychometrician here at Alpine, just starting up my 8th year here at Alpine, and I live in the country just outside of Lincoln, Nebraska.
So thank you all so much for joining us today. We're here to talk about job task analysis and building a bridge from job role to credentialing exam. So we'll start off today with asking a question for your programs. Are you constructing a solid bridge from your job role to your exam blueprint and then on to the content of your exam? I think most everybody will recognize the Golden Gate Bridge in the bottom right corner, strong, sturdy, stable bridge. If you've never seen the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, in the upper left corner was the original bridge that was built 1938 to 1940 and collapsed within a year of opening because it wasn't built with deep enough or wide enough girders. So it didn't have a strong enough foundation. And the metaphor here is meant to express how critical it is to make sure that when you define the content for your certification programs, that you have solid links between how you define the purpose of your exam to how you define what goes on to the exam and the content and all the steps that follow in that process. You want to be very strong and stable. So the purpose of this discussion today is to focus on some of the key concepts and considerations when you're defining a content domain. For a credentialing exam, that's what we call a job task analysis. If we think about a high quality test, what are we looking for? We start with thinking about, does it address the purpose of the credentialing program? Why are you doing this? That would include, who is your target audience? What do you intend for that credentialing, for those certification candidates to be able to do with their credential? So what is that initial first piece of information, and making sure that's very solid. Following on that, we want to measure the intended construct. Now, construct is just a fancy way for saying that thing we want to measure or that thing you want to test. And so for a credentialing exam, we're looking at a domain, a content domain that is made up of tasks that a professional does on the job and the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are necessary for competent performance on that job. From there, we want to make sure that we can make that link from the job role to that domain, and then finally to a test blueprint. If you are new to testing and you don't know what a blueprint is, it's really just the test plan. It says what you're going to measure, it says the level at which you're going to measure, and it gives some information about how much of each thing you want to measure you're going to put on that test. And the goal here is to produce scores that lead to valid interpretation of the examinee's ability in that given content domain or on that given job role. So what we want to talk about today is not really step-by-step, this is what you do, although we're going to go through the process at a high level of one way to do a job analysis, because everything we do in test development has multiple ways we may be able to do this that are defensible. We're going to talk at a high level about one method for doing that, but really drill down into some areas where programs tend to be more challenged, where it's more challenging if you're accredited or if you have concerns for legal defensibility or ensuring that your test scores are defensible.
All right, if you've attended some of our other webinars, like the health check and maintenance webinar we did a few weeks ago, this should be probably a familiar graphic for you. We use it frequently to describe at a high level the test development process for a credentialing exam, or really for most any exam as well. You can see here that analyzing the domain and developing the blueprint are highlighted in red, because those are really the areas that we're going to discuss today. And so we have them identified so you can see where in the test development process we're focusing our discussion today. So we're assuming at this point of the process, when you start talking about doing a job task analysis, you've already decided on the purpose of your exam program or your certification or licensure program. And you already have a fairly good start on the idea of what the test is going to be like in terms of its structure and length. At this point in the process, we have to decide, as Diane mentioned, that what content is going to be on the exam, what content is fair game, and then specify that in detail as part of a test blueprint. At every stage through this test development process, we're collecting evidence to support validity. And remember that validity is a property of the interpretation of uses of test scores. So we want to make sure we are collecting evidence at each step of the way that is supporting the use of our exam scores. Analyzing the domain is a lot of times we do it as a job task analysis, but it also happens in the K-12 exams. If you have kids in school, the similar type of activity there would be, you might think about as a state reading standards. For example, if you say, well, somebody's decided what students should be able to know and do in reading in 4th grade. And a lot of times for states, that's taken as a given. Those are just given to the states. They're adopted on a statewide level, and they don't have to be specified during the test development process. And that's one of the big distinctions between credentialing exam development and K-12 educational exams, is that we have to actively determine what the appropriate content of the exam is based on what are the requirements of the job.
So I would also add on to that is that an exam might be used for employment selection. And sometimes your certification exams, the programs that you've developed, are used for those purposes as well. So we think about what procedures do we use that will provide a solid foundation and defensible content-related validity evidence. So basically just saying we've documented how we decided what the content domain would be across multiple kinds of assessments in credentialing, and as well as employment selection, or if you're doing a domain analysis in educational testing, as Brett just described. So if we think about what is the domain analysis, it's a systematic way of identifying the tasks, the knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to perform those tasks competently in a job role. We might call this a job analysis. It could be called a job task analysis, a practice analysis. Role delineation study is another way I've heard it described. So there's lots of different ways of describing this, and different ways that these can be performed. Why do we do it? Well, the results of the job analysis form the basis of what's being measured. It provides our foundation. It's how we know what to put on the test, how to write the questions, what kinds of questions should go on that test, at what level should we be writing those questions. Is this a basic question? A basic test, or is this a more advanced test, an expert level test? And it's always important to think about it as separate from a curriculum domain, right? So we develop testing objectives instead of learning objectives. And it's different because there are things that are taught in curriculum that we can't measure in a standard test. And so you have to think too about how you're going to test, and whether you have a standard multiple choice exam, there's a limit to what tasks you can test from the job domain. It provides information to be translated into the test blueprint. So this is what makes up your final test plan, your test objectives, your targeted cognitive level. So that idea of at what level are you testing? Is it a basic knowledge test? Is it more advanced than that? And then the content weighting. How do we decide if we are building, let's just say for simplicity's sake, we're going to build a 50-item multiple choice exam. How do we know how many items to put on the exam for each of the things we want to measure? So it provides us with the support, the information to make those decisions, and then supporting validity evidence for test score interpretation. And then we look to, of course, always first and foremost, industry best practices standards, and then thinking about legal considerations. And so we'll touch on those three things briefly before we get into more methodology and specific considerations. So if you think about industry best practices, there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of people attending conferences providing me with information about how to develop your tests. The consensus is pretty strong in the fact that you need a job analysis to support the adequacy and defensibility of your test score interpretations and use, and making sure that your job analysis produces a content framework that's going to be fair, to ensure it links to the job, and that you're not just choosing things you think that are good for professionals to know, but that people in the profession are serving on your panels and deciding what goes on those exams, and that you have legal defensibility. When we think about the standards, there are three top standards that we look to. The standards for educational and psychological measurement are standards that were developed jointly between the American Psychological Association, the National Council for Measurement and Education, and I'm drawing a total blank, American Educational Research Association, my apologies. Basically giving a very high level for our industry, for credentialing, of what is expected to support valid, reliable score interpretation. So what sort of things do we need to do in our processes to ensure that we're meeting standards? Well, we need to make sure we do a job analysis. We make sure that any tasks or information that are being included in that domain are credential worthy performance, so that we're picking the most important and critical things in the job role, that we have a rationale for the methods we use, and that we're documenting who's involved in those processes. The National Council for Certifying Agencies is one of two accrediting agencies that we commonly have clients who want accreditation, and they dictate the need for a job analysis and similar sort of documentation, as well as ANSI, which is the American arm of the ISO standards for personnel and certification association certifications. A certification scheme they refer to a program as a scheme, and that you need to make sure that you define the elements, the scope, the job tasks and descriptions. What is it? What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that a candidate needs to know? So all of them are asking us to make sure that we have defined that content domain thoroughly, systematically, and that we've documented that. Concerns of legal defensibility are typically highest with high-stakes exams, where exams might be used for employment decisions, hiring, firing, raises, promotions. It happens mostly when there are inappropriate uses of exams and when there are issues of bias and discrimination. Discrimination is the #1 issue from a legal perspective, where there is grounds for a suit against an exam. We've pulled in one piece of information from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission guidelines. These are basically an implementation of the Civil Rights Act, and indicating that if you're going to use an exam for employment selection, you need to make sure that you've documented what work behaviors are relevant and the associated tasks with those, making sure that those are important and critical behaviors, that we're not measuring things that are not essential. I mean, this is one glimpse into it. The legal side of this is very complex, and if you have additional questions at the end, we're going to have time for questions at the end, but we didn't want to delve too far into the legal issues related to exams, only that for legal defensibility, a job analysis is required.
Right, so we saw in the previous slides saying that there's laws and standards out there saying you really should be doing a job analysis, but really you should want to anyway, because it's really the key to identifying that the content on your test is fair and you're supporting valid decision making. Because really what the job analysis does is it's a step in a process what we're working to do is to establish some sort of logical argument that there's a clear link between what the exam is assessing and what happens on the job. Thinking, for example, of a licensure program where folks aren't allowed to work in a profession unless they've passed the test to earn that license. If we're going to hold someone to that standard, just common sense fairness would dictate we really need to have the content of that exam be closely tied to what happens on the job. In the same way for a voluntary credentialing program or certification program, if we're going to say that someone has a particular set of skills that qualifies them for some advanced recognition, then we need to make sure that the content on the exam really ties in to the content that we're saying, or those skills that we're saying somebody has when they have earned that credential. So when we want to tie an exam to a job, we need to know what skills and tasks, what people actually do on that job. And so what the job task analysis is one particular methodology to research and find out the most critical salient elements of what somebody performs on a job. The one we're going to talk about today, there's multiple methodologies out there, but one that's very common in credentialing exams is a methodology sometimes referred to as a job task inventory. For a job task inventory, one of the common methodologies of doing that is you're bringing a panel of subject matter experts, folks who are working in that field, to talk about what they do on the job, what kind of tasks or competencies or skills or areas of knowledge is necessary to meet some minimum level of performance. And I don't mean minimum performance in a negative way. It's just whenever we're going to make a decision whether somebody does or doesn't get a license or earn a credential, we tend to think about somebody who's at the very end of that spectrum, at that transition point between somebody who's not qualified to earn the credential and somebody who is qualified. So we're not, in many cases, we're thinking about somebody who is entry level with respect to the particular position we're developing a credential for. And that may be a very high level of skill. So depending on the type of credential we're talking about. So we need to bring in subject matter experts, those who are familiar with that level of performance at an entry level, for an entry level candidate. You might be familiar with the term minimally qualified candidate if you do work in standard settings, so setting passing scores. So just as it's important to understand your expectations of a minimally qualified candidate when you're setting a passing score, it's also, as you do a job task analysis or a job task inventory, at the beginning of the process, having a discussion with subject matter experts about what the expectations for a minimally qualified candidate are is a really good place to begin your discussion. And it will carry through the test development process all the way through to later in the process where you're setting a passing score. We tend to start out with that focus group, a small group of folks to talk about, brainstorm those tasks and competencies that actually happen on the job. And then we tend to, when possible, survey a broader portion of the target population of folks who are working in that position or in that type of job role. We have other methodologies out there that all have different positives and negative aspects of it. There's methodologies like where we might send out a lengthy diary, a journal, where to a large number of folks in a profession, where they could document what they do every day for over a 2-week period, for example. Or we might do even a kind of a more qualitative observational type methodology. You could imagine maybe if you're determining what a police officer does, sending somebody out on a ride along to see what's going on in terms of what they do on a daily basis. So there's multiple ways of doing that. And actually, it turns out it isn't that far-fetched to involve psychometricians in law enforcement as well. because actually it turns out we're very useful in hostage situations. And that if you can bring in a psychometrician and you give us a megaphone, and we get to start and ask us to explain item response theory, it's very effective in lulling criminals into a stupor or to sleep. So, so I'll hand it over to you, Diane.
Thank you, Brett. As Brett just went through kind of this process at a high level, here's just a graphical representation of that. Assembling a representative panel, making sure that the minimally qualified candidate is defined. We would often have an initial definition of this minimally qualified candidate from the initial program and test design, and would take that and refine it in this process. Identify the most important tasks, having those subject matter experts think about what they do on the job, and more specifically, what do they expect the minimally qualified candidate should be able to do on the job, and at what level they should be able to perform. Then drilling down into knowledge, skills, and or abilities. Abilities are usually reserved for performance-based testing. If you get to that higher level of expert level exams, you can measure more directly abilities, but most of the objective level exams that we develop in certification are more of knowledge and skills. What are those knowledge and skills that are most critical for being able to perform competently on the job? And then we take those and we translate into a measurable test objectives. For some organizations, they'll still call these task statements. It's similar sort of concept, just making sure that those statements are written in such a way that they are measurable in the format that you intend for your test to be. And then we take those and we draft an exam blueprint, design and administer a survey, and then we analyze the survey results to establish a final blueprint, set of blueprint weights. And we're going to go into more detail on all that in just a second.
We mentioned the first step in this job task analysis, this particular variation we're talking about, is to assemble a group of stakeholders who are going to, so they could be program stakeholders who are involved in the development of the program, but we also want to make sure we include subject matter experts. And again, we have to be a little bit careful with the term subject matter experts, in that we use it a lot in test development, but I think sometimes it's overinterpreted. When we say the term expert, folks think about, rock stars in the field, people who are, of very advanced ability, and with 30 years of experience and all kinds of accolades and awards. But really, when we're talking about subject matter experts, we're talking about folks who are have shown sufficient competency to kind of earn the credential we're talking about. So, for example, if we're talking about optometrists, just about anyone who's earned their license as an optometrist could potentially be considered for a subject matter expert. But really, what we want is to make sure this panel is representative, and it's representative of the profession in several ways. We mentioned some of those here, like geographical region, the job context, the practice setting or role, years of experience, and other demographic variables. With respect to experience, I like to use kind of the terms, old school, new school, and school. So some combination of old school, so you're experienced professionals who've been in the field, so maybe five years or more. New school being kind of those newly licensed or newly credentialed professionals, folks who are newer to the field, who are more familiar with the current state of entry-level practice in the field. And school, so trainers or educators who are preparing candidates for performing in that particular role, because they're also aware of what it takes for entry-level practice in a given field or performing with a given certification. So the specific blend of those will vary based on the particular program in question. So you might, some programs might be more heavily focused on newly licensed or newly credentialed professionals as part of this group. So we make sure we're kind of getting a current view. But it can vary. And we'll talk some more about this later on. We always get the question, how many people should be on a focus group or a panel like this? And the typical psychometrician answer is that it depends. Really, we're looking at, 8 to 12 maybe might be reasonable to include there. The challenge is finding a balance between a panel that's so small that it can't realistically represent the diversity of the job role, and we could kind of call into the question the validity of that process. On the other hand, if we have a panel that's so large that we cover every possible subgroup with multiple folks, it becomes unwieldy for a facilitator or a group of facilitators to get everybody involved in the important discussions that happen when we start out a focus group activity like that.
So I would just add to that, in cases where we do use really large panels, one of the methods we use to manage is breaking them into smaller groups and doing more small group work. It sometimes helps so that all the voices can be heard when you can't get them all together in the big panel, or everyone doesn't have an opportunity to give their opinions in the bigger panels. We do work some with smaller panels as well, and how small is too small is hard to say. Some professions, particularly in IT, there's a little less diversity, so a smaller panel might be warranted as long as the representatives are still representing the different contexts in which a professional might work, and that you keep in mind that when you have 5 people as opposed to 10, each of those people has a greater impact on those end results. And that in those cases, that blueprint survey becomes even more critical, because now you're sending that content domain that you've defined out to the broader population and getting more feedback on the results to make sure that you've properly defined the job role and created a strong blueprint. If we think back to the process, just giving a few more details about what happens in an actual job task analysis meeting. If, for example, we're doing an in-person meeting, it would typically be 2 to 3 days for a standard job task analysis or task inventory for that particular method of doing a job analysis. During that, we would start with talking about the MQC, the minimally qualified candidate, defining who that is, making sure we understand what are the eligibility requirements, if there are any, what is their education level, how many years of experience do you expect they have, do they have any experience? And we talk a lot about, what can they do independently, what do they need assistance with, what is considered more senior level role, so that's well beyond their abilities, what's below their abilities, what is something we wouldn't even measure because it's so simple and straightforward, it wouldn't be worthy of being on the test. So we work really hard to draw some very clear boundaries around who that minimally qualified candidate is. And that doesn't just help in our job task analysis, that helps us as we move forward and we develop content, we set the cut score. As Brett mentioned earlier, we use that definition throughout the entire test development process, including going back for maintenance and thinking about, are we testing the right people? And so that making sure that's clear and that you have a consensus among your subject matter experts about who that is really critical. We usually ask the subject matter experts to say, what are your top 5 to 6 tasks you think a minimally qualified candidate would do? And we go through and we flesh out what those most important high-level things are, things that are specific to that job role and important. And then we categorize those. We put them into groupings and we weed through to make sure we've created a very coherent and sensible framework And that's a lot of what's happening in a job analysis is what does the MQC do, what's most important, and how do we put this in some kind of a framework that will become the blueprint and create a comprehensive plan for moving forward in test development. We drill down into the knowledge, skills, and abilities. What does someone need to know in order to do each of these tasks? What are the knowledge and skills? If it's performance-based, we might get into abilities. What are the specific abilities we're going to ask them to demonstrate in a performance-based test? And then we get into the ideas of what's the cognitive level of each of these tasks that they're doing and the knowledge and skills. At what level do they need to do this? Are they just going to have basic knowledge of it? Do they need to apply it? Are they going to take it to the next level and have to think more complexly, make a judgment, solve a problem, and demonstrate that they have a higher level of expertise in this area? And then we use all that information to translate those tasks into measurable objectives. And as I mentioned before, this is really just refining those task statements so that we know that they're written in a way that we can write test questions to these and that they are measurable.
And that's a good point that Leanne mentioned about that minimally qualified candidate discussion is really integral to the process because it does carry through to multiple areas. We talked about standard setting, but it's also important for item writing as well, because remember that we'd like, when we're making pass-fail decisions about folks, we want to make sure that we have the most information we can on the exam in the neighborhood of that pass-fail decision. And that pass-fail decision is made in the area of the ability that we consider for minimally qualified candidates. So knowing what the minimally qualified candidate is before you do a standard setting can help not only in the job task analysis, but also in the standard setting. An important thing to point out here too is thinking about what Diane just said about the questions we ask our subject matter focus group. We ask the question, what do you expect of an entry-level candidate? That's the discussion we have can be driven by who is selected for that panel. If you're able to recruit recently licensed folks or recently credentialed folks to be on that panel, you can ask a potentially somewhat easier question is, what do you do on the job? Because by definition, they are recently credentialed, and so they are very proximate to what we expect of an entry-level person. It's more of a stretch, it's more of a challenge if we get very experienced folks on the panel who are maybe 10 or 20 years removed from being an entry-level professional themselves. A lot of times we'll have to rephrase the question, what would you expect an entry-level person to do? So those are totally different questions. What do you do on the job versus what do you expect an entry-level person to do? And the way we ask those questions is driven by who we're able to recruit for our that activity. We also mentioned in the previous slide, it's not just important to identify what things you need to know to do the job and the actual tasks you do on the job, but we want to have a good understanding of how deep of an understanding you need to have of these particular elements of the job to perform effectively. In some areas, it might just be you need to know the facts. And you just might need to remember the facts and the definitions and the rote process that you follow step by step exactly. And in other cases, you maybe need to have a really deep understanding of a particular area in order to analyze and evaluate a novel situation and solve a problem that comes up that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so we put up an example here of there's multiple ways to define cognitive complexity, and you might have heard Bloom's taxonomy is one that if folks have heard about cognitive complexity, they may have heard of that one. We have a different example that's a little bit simplified up here on the screen. So as we're working through with our subject matter experts, the kind of things they need to know on the job, and the kind of tasks they need to do. We also discuss with those panelists what level of understanding they need to have to perform each of those tasks, because that can help guide the item writing as well. Because we not only want to have the items on the exam matched to the job tasks that are actually being done, but we also want to have them measure at the same level. So if you really need to analyze and evaluate on the job, but you're only writing remember level questions where people are just remembering facts, then even though you are measuring appropriate content, you're not measuring it at an appropriate level for the exam. So it's important and something we recommend during the job task analysis process is to, when you're developing things like test objectives based on those job tasks, that you explicitly call out the level of cognitive complexity you would expect entry-level candidate would be able to do for each of those tasks. And recognizing as well that not every, that it may be different for each objective that you're measuring. Some areas you find all you need is remember, other areas where you really need to have an analyze and evaluate level of understanding. So it'll vary in many cases by those the particular areas of the profession.
So once we've finished defining the content areas, we have our tasks, knowledge, skills, and abilities. We've defined the cognitive level of those areas. The next thing to do is to think about creating a blueprint survey. And these are kind of presented as discrete tasks in this process, but really we start thinking about the blueprint survey while we're working with the panel. We often involve the panel in selecting the scales we're going to use. Do we want to think about the importance of each task or objective? Do we want to think about the frequency? Is criticality more important? Thinking criticality as more, are there consequences if a professional doesn't know how to do something on the job? There are many scales, and we're not going to delve into the details of this. We could do a very long session on just creating a blueprint survey and survey best practices and the kinds of scales we use and how we analyze them and such. We're going to keep this at a high level for this particular presentation. But we usually involve the program owners as well as the subject matter experts in those decisions, and sometimes tweaking those scales to make sure that when they go out to a sample from the broader population of professionals, that the questions that we're asking them make sense, that they understand what we're trying to get at here with these surveys. You know, are these tasks things that you actually do on the job, or you expect of a minimally qualified candidate if you are a more seasoned professional? And how important are they? How often are they done? So that we can collect some information about, yes, we identified everything that's critical to be included on the test, and how much of all of that should we put in each area of the test. So when we define a survey or design a survey, we start with making sure that we've made the purpose clear, that any instructions in that survey are clear and concise. Concision is a critical piece to these surveys. Creating long, drawn-out descriptions and instructions can make the surveys longer, and it's challenging to get response rates, decent response rates on these surveys as it is. You want to make sure everything is as clear and concise as possible. You want to make sure that the program's been clearly defined and who the minimally qualified candidate is. Not everybody going in and taking one of these surveys is going to understand what a minimally qualified candidate is or why we measure at that level. So it requires some description and explanation in the survey. Selecting a level of domain to survey, most programs will stick to the task level. I've probably been involved in 2 surveys in the past that have done this at the knowledge and skill level. Those make for very long surveys, and so in order to do that, I would say there needs to be a really strong rationale for it. What is your reason for wanting to collect information at that knowledge and skill level? And in those surveys, information is usually also collected at the task and the domain levels as well. But those do produce some very detailed blueprint surveys that are most of the time beyond what you need for a test plan. So think about what makes sense for your program and what's realistic to put in a survey and get people to actually respond to your survey and finish the survey. Selecting survey scales, as I said, frequency, importance, and criticality are three of the common ones. There are many more out there, different ways of asking about importance and criticality, education level, difficulty of the task and sometimes asked, so many ways of doing this. And so thinking about what it is you really want to know that you're going to use to base your weights on for your blueprint. So what's most important to think about in that process? You need to identify a representative sample. In some cases, you may invite everybody who's already certified if you have access to that population. Identifying that sample can sometimes be challenging. If you don't have parameters around your population, you don't know who all your population is, or maybe you don't have contact information, you don't know how to contact those people. So this can be a challenging step in the process, but really critical to make sure, thinking about that list we talked about in selecting your panel, your sample should look like that list. It should be representative practice settings, job context, years of experience, regional areas, other demographics, and not all of those will be represented in every panel, and not all of those will be represented in every survey. At the highest level, you would think about all of those elements when you're setting your parameters for your sample. A smaller testing program or a more homogeneous testing program, or one where it's not accredited or you're not doing this for high stakes, you may not look as deeply into some of those demographics such as race, ethnicity, gender, if those aren't relevant and important considerations for defensibility. So you want to develop and execute a communication plan. Know how you're going to communicate, know how you're going to administer the survey. Most of these are done online these days. There's lots of software out there to do this, websites that do this. Free versions of it are usually have limited functionality, but sometimes they're adequate for doing a small scale survey, and then administer that survey, and finally analysis. This is an example of just a very small, straightforward blueprint. If you've not seen one before, we typically have domains. These are just high-level sections. You know, we talked about the subject matter experts will define those tasks, and then they'll categorize those kind of into groups here. This is a survey that would have been done at the objective or task level. Each of these numbers represents a task or objective. The cognitive complexity levels for each of these, and then those weights that were generated from survey analysis. And this is an example of one for a 20-item test. Ways that we translate those results into blueprint. This is where we get to be really nerdy in the psychometric world and decide what we want to do with these scales. It's not uncommon to weight one scale more than another if you've used multiple scales. If you've decided to use a single scale, say an importance scale, there's no weighting to be done. You can just translate that into your blueprint weights and your number of items. If you have a more complex program and you've asked, say, frequency and criticality really gets to what are the consequences if a professional doesn't know how to do a particular task. Is there harm to the public, the profession, or to themselves? Is there harm can be defined in many ways. You know, is there financial harm? Do systems come down if there's some kind of a system administrator, if they don't know how to do this? So sometimes there's a choice to weight one scale more than the other. You have to decide how to combine the scales, and there are a number of ways to do this. One example is a multiplicative model where we take into consideration information about not only means of the ratings, but also kind of the variability of those ratings. If candidates have, or if participants in that survey may have had some variability in the way they use the scales, we take those things into consideration when we're scaling here. Again, we're not going to delve into the nerdy psychometrics of this here, but just decisions that have to be made when you're deciding how to do the blueprint weight. And then finally, we determine the number of items for each task and objective. That's usually based on decisions that are made in the initial test design process, where you may say, I'm going to create a 70-item multiple choice exam, or you're creating something more complex than that, say for a performance-based test. You may use those weights for deciding how to distribute content. Finally, in thinking about the job task analysis process, thinking about documentation. Documentation is critical. You want to document panel qualifications and representation. We'll often use a standard biographical survey so that we make sure that every panelist, we have the same information we can provide in our reports, as well as any additional information that may have been provided from a member of the panel or from the program owners. Rationale for your selected methodology, the procedures of that. Where did you meet? When did you meet? For how long did you meet? What happened in that meeting? What happened after that meeting? The process used for the blueprint survey and all the choices that you had to make about the scales you used and how you converted those scales into the results of those scales into a blueprint. And then all of your outcomes, including draft and final blueprints, all of your task knowledge, skills, and abilities that were documented, your cognitive levels, and then methodologies. You want to make sure are documented. When we are documented, we're looking for making sure you can find that information when you come back to this and say, hey, who was involved in that? Hey, what did we do here? How did we do this? Making sure you have documentation if you're an accredited program or you ever want to seek accreditation. Important for legal defensibility, and important just as good best practices and good research practices to make sure that your methods are replicable, that somebody could go back and they could see every step of the process that you used. Sometimes we have to be highly adaptable. We have to go back to those standards that we showed you. We have to go back to those best practices and say, you know what, we've got some challenges here. How do we adapt in a way that we are still aligning with those standards and best practices? Some of those challenges may be recruiting subject matter experts, limited resources such as funding. Money is always in short supply when it comes to developing exams. Identifying the survey population is sometimes a challenge. Sometimes the organization for whom you work has limitations in personal information that you can collect, or whether you can do an online survey. So sometimes those are challenges, or that there are low response rates to the surveys. Quickly changing content is a really big one in the IT area. So sometimes we'll do a job analysis virtually as opposed to in person. So we work really hard to make sure those virtual meetings collect the same kind of information and have the same kind of group dynamics as close as we can to those in-person meetings. We will sometimes conduct an impact study to look at, has your content changed enough that you need to do a new job analysis, or if maybe only 1 or 2 sections of your blueprint have changed, maybe we only need to do a job task review, not a full 2 or 3 day meeting to accommodate a faster changing market.
Great. And I'm just going to finish this up by talking about a few accreditation considerations. Before I do, I want to remind everybody just kind of the point of all this that we're talking about here is that we want to make sure our exam is tied to the job. So we start out the process by just asking a group of folks to come in who work in that particular job role and say, well, what do you do on the job and what do you need to know to be able to perform that work effectively? And then we take their answers to that, make that into a survey, send it out to a broader swath of the population and say, do you agree with these folks? Is this what you do on the job? And if so, how important is it to that job? And then when we get those results back, we aggregate that together and then use that, put it through some analyses and discussions to come up with our final test blueprint that we use then as a tool to guide item writing and form development later on. So the goal is we're developing this logical progression from identifying what's on the job to creating test items on the test that align to those knowledge, skills, and abilities. For folks seeking accreditation, if you have a credentialing program that you want to get a third-party accreditation for, or are considering it, or may consider it somewhere down the road, or just want to try to follow along with what those organizations view as good practice, here's some areas related to job task analyses that where folks tend to run into stumbling blocks. First of all, a big problem is that subject matter experts aren't viewed as sufficiently representative of the population. A second stumbling block is that there's insufficient linkage or documentation of that relationship between the job task analysis results and how the blueprint was created, and also between the job task results and the content of the exam itself. A third stumbling block is that there's lack of evidence for the rationale of how long you have to wait before somebody gets recertified. And a corresponding question is, how often do you need to do another JTA? We mentioned before, it's really important to have representative panels. You need to have representation both in your job task analysis panel and your survey sample that you're sending it out. That requires that you have some sort of knowledge of your profession and important stakeholder groups. There isn't a one-size-fits-all option because different organizations have different policy considerations in terms of who are the particular stakeholder groups that need to be included. But keep in mind that a job task analysis survey does help to meet this expectation. So that's an important reason why that these accrediting bodies, while they won't say that they require a survey, it's if you're not going to do a survey along with as part of your job task analysis to get that broader input from the profession, you should have a really good reason. Again, when we say we're representative, how should it be representative? We mentioned some of these already, but it's important to consider important demographic and professional distinctions when you're selecting your panel, and also when you're evaluating if your survey respondents are representative of your profession as a whole. Establish those clear linkages. Dan already mentioned the importance of documentation. In addition, it's important to provide a rationale for showing how you determine your blueprint weights based on your job task analysis results. So it's not enough to have that just say, yes, we had a focus group and we did a survey. You need to provide an explanation of how you use those survey results to determine the actual test blueprint that you created. To say, yes, we had this focus group, we did this survey, and here's the steps that we did to determine the blueprint, the test blueprint based on those results. And in some cases that can be quite technical. So I think in many cases you may need to look to your psychometricians to help with that documentation. And additionally, once you have a test blueprint, you need to provide some evidence verifying that you are in fact creating content that matches those areas. So we're going a little bit beyond the parts of our test development process here where we discussed earlier, analyzing the domain and the test blueprint, but moving into the areas where we need to take a look at during the item review process, on the item development process, we make sure that items are being developed that, one, hit the appropriate content areas as defined by your test blueprint to show that it matches content-wise, and also that your items are at an appropriate cognitive level, that it's measuring that cognitive complexity that we mentioned before as well. So it's important, the work of matching your exam to the job doesn't stop with the JTA. It continues into the item writing and review process as well. So it's important to document that you have put your items through that review and document your process to ensure that your forms are being assembled in a way that they meet your test blueprint. Finally, While you're in the process of collecting this information, doing these surveys, it's a good idea to ask. You already have people thinking about what skills are necessary for the job. It's important to take the opportunity to ask, how often do those skills or the job tasks change? And it may be as simple as adding one additional question to your job analysis or survey. How often is there substantial changes in the tasks or skills needed to perform your position? And that can help provide evidence-based rationale for making decisions of how long should people be credentialed before having to recertify, or how often should I have to conduct another job task analysis to make sure my test is in line with current expectations in the profession.
And I think we are down to the last couple of minutes. If there are a couple of questions we could answer. I'm actually not sure how I would see questions here.
Diane, it doesn't look like there are any questions in the panel.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And we hope we have provided a little bit of useful information you can take away from this. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.